Okay, good morning everybody, and thank you very much for joining us on our Road to 2012 presentation this morning. For anyone who's joined our previous sessions on the 2008 R2, we're going to just evolve that now into the next stage in regards of 2012, more focused around 2012 features, some of the licensing changes within that as well. Again, if anyone has joined us previously, there are going to be a couple of slides which are similar in regards of the reasons to change, upgrading your SQL Server. So just bear with me and we'll get through them. Okay, so the agenda today is going to focus on a few points which are similar again to last week's, but again with a focus to 2012. So the first is going to be just an introduction. Next is going to be why and who DSP are. Next is going to be the reasons for upgrading to SQL Server. Then we're going to do a few key features of 2012. So some of you may have heard of them, some of you may not be familiar at all with any features. So hopefully these are a few pointers which may really kind of get you interested in 2012. Then we're going to have a short video from Samuel from Microsoft on the SQL Server licensing model and changes in 2012. Then we're going to do a little session on how DSP can help you upgrade your estate, and that's really going to focus on a current piece of work that we at DSP have been working on at the moment, one of our 2012 prospective customers. And lastly, we're just going to summarise with a Q&A session. Okay, so just the introductions as follows. So first of all, myself is Dan Stilwell. I'm a senior architect at DSP. I'm also joined, sitting next to me, by Mark Jones, who's a colleague of mine, who's also a senior architect at DSP. And we also have Sam Solomon, who's a Microsoft partner. Unfortunately, Sam cannot be with us today. I think he's in Brussels, actually. So, but what he's kindly done is organised and delivered the video session on the 2012 licensing changes. So again, I'll play that. It's about a 15-minute presentation. So again, I'll play that halfway through so you guys are fully aware of everything that's changing from a Microsoft perspective. Okay, so very quickly, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this slide. I just want to go through a couple of points on who DSP are. So as I said, myself and Mark work for DSP. We're a recognised enterprise database specialist, and we've been formed since about 1999. So again, we work with the key products in regards of Oracle and with Microsoft SQL Server. So again, we are an award-winning use of enterprise database platform. So again, many awards in regards of Oracle and from the data platform from Microsoft as well. We're also a 2-year running Microsoft Gold partner, and our specialism is in data platforms. And again, this is quite a unique aspect in the UK actually. So there's only a handful of other Gold partner specialists in the data platform realms. Next, we're also obviously a launch partner of Microsoft for the SQL Server 2012 products. And lastly, but probably the most important point of it all, is you've actually already seen and been having experience with architecting a SQL Server 2012 solution, which again, my colleague Mark will go into more detail later in the presentation. Okay, so the first section is going to be on the reasons for upgrading SQL Server now. Okay, so like I said at the beginning, some of these slides are the same as what was presented last week. So there's only 3, and I'll try to whip through them as quickly as possible. But for people joining who are not familiar with this slide, really my focus here is really having a plan of action on the reasons you want to upgrade. So many times we see people upgrading for maybe support reasons alone. So these 3 slides hopefully illustrate other reasons or questions that we may want to have around that. So first of all, before we get an understanding of where we want to go to, we have to understand from a SQL Server and a Microsoft perspective of where the product has actually come from. So this is just a quick going through the demo in about 30 seconds of, the different editions of SQL Server in about 30 seconds. So ultimately, the objective from Microsoft in SQL Server 2012 is to have a reliable, stable platform which customers have confidence in supporting their Tier 1 database and applications. Okay, so that's what Microsoft has been striving for the last 4 generations of SQL Server. They want to get market share ultimately of the Tier 1 applications and the Tier 1 database backend systems. Up until now, obviously everyone's aware of the market leader being Oracle. So again, Microsoft has been developing its additions to hopefully building upon features, scalability, performance and security to make sure that the customer has the enhanced product which really does deliver to that tier 1 needs and requirements. So just quickly, so from 2000 was really the first edition of SQL Server, which I think was really that enterprise standard. So obviously the history of Microsoft SQL Server tracks back from the 90s with Microsoft working closely with Sybase and then developing SQL Server 6.5 and 7 from 96 and 98. Microsoft then really did take on a new strand of enterprise products in SQL Server 2000. Again, with incorporating some much more stability, incorporating some high availability as well, albeit in quite a non-mature format in that. Microsoft then took 5 years out, ultimately, to build and write SQL Server 2005. Now, this product was a big milestone in regards of Microsoft SQL Server products. So it took 5 years, and the reason that was because that's the first time that SQL Server was rewritten every single line of code from Microsoft development. So from the first time, that's when Sybase wasn't really incorporated into the product. However, obviously the ideology behind the SQL Server engine itself, of course, still goes back to the Sybase days. But the key thing with SQL Server 2005 was that was the first time that customers felt that they could build on their tier 2 and slightly in some of their tier 1 solutions. So for example, the stock exchange was actually built on SQL Server 2005. So again, that then incorporated high availability, stability and scalability as well. Next we had SQL Server 2008. Now 2008 was still quite a major release of SQL Server, but the reason I speak about 2008 is really in regards of the feature list. So what 2005 gave us that fundamental aspects of SQL Server as a database backend platform. But what 2008 did was really build upon that and gave us features, made it easier for the end user, made it easier for the DBA, and made it easier for the business strategy to give ideas. For example, things like policy-based management. So all of a sudden we can actually have auditing and governance around many of our SQL servers for one centralized managed SQL Server. 2008 R2 came out in 2010. Now again, this was more focused on BI supportability. Again, BI was another aspect of that driving towards that tier 1 database platform, and BI really did evolve into this additional SQL Server to become a lot more supportable for the DBA or the BI developer. And then we're at the stage now with SQL Server 2012, and this really is at the stage, I think, where all of the components which make a very serious tier 1 application all come together. And again, the product has evolved, so certain aspects like high availability, scalability, security, again, have built upon the great success that Microsoft has had in the previous generations. We've obviously fixed an awful lot, but more importantly, we're moving forward to actually enhance the business requirements. Okay, so why upgrade? So like I said a couple of slides ago, a lot of people focus upgrades around end of support, end of mainstream support. Now obviously we're all governed to a degree by the vendors. So the vendors will say that they're at the end of mainstream support for the product. Well, then we have to upgrade. And the reason we have to upgrade is ultimately, if we do have an issue on the actual box itself, then we won't get support from the vendors or direct support without spending quite a bit of money on extended support. So really, what should we do? So really, what we're focused about doing now is making sure that we're maximizing what the business needs and then putting in place a solution to really enhance that business needs. Okay, so again, now I've matched technology to the business requirements. So please, when you're thinking about the upgrade or what additional SQL Server to go to, really have a look at the feature list. Have a look at your business needs, what you need to achieve out of the business, what will make it more streamlined, what will make it more cost efficient, or what may even reduce costs all in all. And then pick that particular product and make sure that you are using their features to make your life easier as well. Okay, so some of the questions that I've listed here that you should be asking as decision makers within the business are, what features can maximize my business potential? You know, do I pay a third party for security governance where actually I have policy-based management built into 2008 and 2008 R2 already? Do I look at tuning tools from a third party? Or actually, do I have Query Resource Governor built into SQL Server 2008, 2008 R2 already? So them kind of things are really around what can maximise the business potential, ultimately what can make your life easier, be it as a decision maker or an IT strategy decision maker within the company, or even the DBA level as well. And most importantly, in this day and age with the economy downturn, it's what really can save me money. Am I paying on unnecessary third-party tools, or can SQL Server actually do what I want it and need it to do? However, we do need to be aware of supportability. So again, I've just noted here the end of the mainstream support for SQL Server 2000, 2005, 2008, and 2008 R2. So don't be surprised why I've got 2000 mainstream support ended in the 8th of April 2008 here. There are still many, many systems which are running SQL Server 2000. So again, this has been out of support now for coming up to 4 years. It's a product which is 12 years old now, but it is still used on many, many systems. And again, some of the difficulties around that are the upgrade paths, legacy components like DTS could be a main one, 32-bit to 64-bit infrastructure is another one, and then most importantly, normally is application support. But again, I would really try and stress now that we really need to be looking at trying to move on to obviously a supported addition of SQL Server there. Not just for the supportability for Microsoft, but like I said, more importantly, you will see many, many more business uses out of the latest additions. Next, we've still got many, many SQL servers within the Europe and Middle East and Africa region, which are used in 2005. So again, this ran out of support coming up to a year ago now. And then the reason I've got 2008 and 2008 R2 mainstream support ending on the 14th of January 2014, obviously notice that's in green, so you are still in support. But the reason I've noticed that is obviously when we're talking about SQL Server 2012 coming out next month, obviously it's really important that as part of your database strategy that we are making notes of when the support for the current versions that you may be on are there. That then hopefully will influence your decision of going to 2012 now, or maybe you may want to go to just 2008 R2 now and then postpone the 2012 upgrade to 6 months. Whatever suits your business needs. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to SQL Server 2012 features. So again, like I said, really please, when I'm going through these slides and speaking, have a think about that Tier 1 application, Tier 1 database, which could be sitting on SQL Server 2012. Okay, so first of all, it's a slide which is a bit confusing, and the purpose was to get that confusion as well. So again, when a new product comes out, there's always lots of confusion about what edition should I be buying, what features will I use, should I go to 2012, should I go to 2008 R2. So this here just is, first of all, is to show there are lots more features from 2012. Okay, so going from 2012 really will make a difference to the actual business in that respect. But the other thing as well is the different features, and the point of the slide is to show that it can be confusing, but really what needs to happen through DSP can help as well, is to go through these features systematically and align them to your business requirements and make sure you're using exactly what you need to be using. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few high-level major changes in 2012. Now, again, there's, as you saw on the previous screen, there's many, many changes in 2012 in regards to features and what the capability of the product can deliver. But I focus around a few, obviously, just because we've got time constraints on this presentation. But if you have got any questions about the features or something else you've heard about and want some clarification on, please feel free to contact us at DSP, and obviously we can speak to you offline about that. Contact details will be on the last slide of this presentation as well. First of all, always on. So always on is a technology based around high availability. So again, throughout the last 10 to 12 years of database and IT solutions as a whole, high availability has been the major driving force. Okay, so now business requirements are that we need our application and our database up and responsive at least 5 nines, so 99.999% of the time. So that includes obviously downtime for patching, for maintenance, for application changes, whatever that may be. The business requirement at the highest point is we need to have high availability. And ultimately, what can SQL Server do to deliver that? Now, in the past, we've had good technology around that. And again, like I said, it's been developed since the 2005 days in regards to Service Pack 1 with mirroring. We've also obviously had clustering for many generations of SQL Server now. We've had log shipping, all of that. So really, we need to focus on the high availability and really going forward, how has that been made easier and more robust? Okay, so one of the major headaches with 2005, 2008, 2008 R2 mirroring, for example, was the fact that in a world where we have multiple databases for a single application, how do we file over all of the databases at one particular time? Now, in the past, I've done it for a few of my customers. We have to use WMI alerts, and that way then with jobs would trigger over one database all at one time. But to be honest with you, it's quite a complex way to set it up, and more importantly, it's actually a complex way of actually then supporting that solution going forward as well. So what does Always On give me? So Always On is based on the physical replication of databases by shipping over the transaction logs. So same as mirroring works now in that respect. But the difference is availability groups. So availability groups uses Windows Server failover clustering for inter-node health detection and failover coordination. I'll go into a little bit of detail about is live and looks live in a moment. But we also have flexibility of the instances being able to host multiple availability groups, so you can failover groups to different instances, and that effectively relieves the pressure on one standby server as well. So if I backtrack a little bit, again, in the 2000 and 2008 days, one of the issues was that mirroring could only go to one destination. There were ways that you would then do multiple destinations with linking in log shipping to your mirroring, but again, that was another complicated scenario. So mirroring was only one destination. You could only mirror one database at a time, unless you use, like I said, WMI alerts. So, and the other thing as well, the actual secondaries is what could you do with them? So what we fix here is really failing over all databases together. So an example of an application would be SharePoint, where it has many databases and can become very dirty, if you like, trying to fail over that application. Next is failing over to multiple secondaries. So again, not just one secondary location, so we could go multiple secondaries. That way then we'll work out that we can actually run backups on another secondary. We can then do reporting on another secondary. And again, all of this is relieving the pressure which we then will face in 2005, 2008. The other thing we can do as well is ultimately, if you've got a 4-server setup, what we can ultimately do is fail over one group of databases, so say your SharePoint, to server 2. But your server, another group of databases from your Cognos application could fail over to server 3. Again, relieving the pressures as well. What sometimes you don't want, and the same with failover clustering, is everything to fail over to that maybe one secondary node, where there may be other resources being used as well, and obviously we can hit performance issues, all of that as well. So I really do think Always On mirroring has really fixed a lot of these issues that we faced in the earlier rounds. So I've already spoken about multiple secondaries to provide one or more remote copies. And again, obviously the key around that as well is site failure as well. So again, if you've got 2 data centers again, you can have other copies maybe to another geographical location in the UK or even out of the UK. It could be a worldwide thing if that's what we desire. And as I've said as well, we've got readable active secondary. I'll just put a disclaimer on here as well. What you will read around 2012 is active secondary. For me, active is a little bit of an interesting phrase, because active for me says that it can be used in regards to read and write. I would say here it's a readable state. So, but what you can do is allow reporting, and as I've said, allow certain backup operations as well. Another section of availability groups. So again, just a little bit of information here of how it works currently in 2005, 2008, and how it can work in the future. So availability groups. So at present, we consider high availability for individual databases. So examples are within mirroring, log shipping, and replication. Or if you want it instance-based, we use clustering. But clustering ultimately doesn't give you data redundancy. What clustering does is ultimately protects your SQL Server service. And I think that's the important point there when we talk about high availability and the differences. And I always recommend, if we have got failover clustering, we should always have another technology to back up and make sure that your SQL Server data is safe and secure. Now what we do is we treat a group of databases as a single entity. So the illustration I've got on that slide ultimately shows you database 1 mirroring over to the mirror instance and database 2 mirroring over to the mirrored instance in a separate entities. Now what we've got is we have availability group where database 1 and database 2 are part of one availability group, and that effectively fails over or mirrors over to the mirrored instance in a streamlined fashion.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, Dan, one of the things that I've used the previous versions of SQL Server quite a bit, and using technologies like mirroring log shipping, one of the things that you had to consider was logins. You had to, if you had multiple secondaries, you had to set the logging up on the primary, and then if that password was to change, you'd also have to migrate that change manually over to the secondary server. Otherwise, when you go to failover, you find things don't work. And that was a real big administrative overhead. And one of the things that maybe isn't on the slide, but is there behind the scenes of SQL Server 2012, is that the logins are actually being moved to the database level. So when you've got these availability groups set up, and you're actually moving all of your credentials to access those databases with that in one fell swoop with availability groups. And that, to me, I mean, as a DBA at heart, is an untold feature that is going to save me many sleepless nights, I'm sure, in the future. But yeah, it's great features all round, and really hits home how well Microsoft have put together the high availability side of this now.
No, excellent point. Thank you, Mark. Okay, so we're still in the realms of high availability and always on, but another key feature is around support of multiple subnets when you're using clustering. So the reason we've got here, so for anyone who's worked with clustering before, again, it can be a bit of a nightmare if we do want to have kind of stretch and geo clusters in that respect. Obviously, there's third-party tools out there which can do that, but it can make it a little bit difficult. And again, we're adding that complexity layer to what should hopefully be a simple solution. All you want is your data available all of the time. Can't be that hard, surely. So what Microsoft have done is, or the way around that is, they've given support for multiple subnets. So, and the way around that is with the dependencies as well in regards to the network and the IP address. Okay, so now we've got an OR dependency as well as AND. Okay, so just bear in mind with that as well. There are a few requirements which I will go into quickly now. So some of the requirements are, it has to be Enterprise Edition of SQL Server 2012. The OS version has to be Windows Server 2008 R2 at least. Probably the major one in regards to cost as well is you do have to have some kind of SAM replication for cross-site DR in that respect. So an example of that is obviously MC, SRDF. So again, not sure some of you guys are using that as well. Again, that's a good technology in regards of making sure that your disks are actually replicated. But the major one as well is, again, the requirement is it has to still be in the same domain. Okay, another enhancement on failover clustering as well. Well, one of the issues we had in the past, again, was how the cluster actually fails over, or how the SQL Server service fails over. And the way it does, I won't go into too much detail about the inner workings of SQL Server and Windows clustering, but we use a couple of tools or built-in features called is alive and looks alive. And by default, the is alive and looks alive are set at 5 and 60-second intervals. And again, they can be changed and hard-coded. But what that ultimately does is it checks for the SQL Server service, and it checks for the version of the SQL, and it polls that particular interview. When interval. When it doesn't get a response, that's at the particular time that it triggers a failover session. Okay, but sometimes what we didn't have in previous versions was we didn't have any control over that, apart from extending that particular time. Okay, so what we've got now is we've got a flexible failover policy, and again we've got 5 conditions now. Well, I should say 0 to 5, so 6 conditions. But ultimately we can determine what SQL would treat as a failover condition, and we can then effectively as well have some of our use-defined errors, if you like, as well, just to trigger that particular ones off. Again, I won't go into the details of exactly what the levels are here, but for example, number 5, failover or restart on any qualified failure condition. So again, we can actually say what severity it would be to actually force the failover of SQL Server. And again, this is important. So when we're thinking about this, or when I speak about high availability, I always try and speak about having a tiered system. Okay, so your tiered one is for your top tier 1 applications, which you need absolute high availability. And that is where you would throw most of your resources, most of your budgeting towards, in regards of hardware and technology as well. But the other thing as well, that you have got some databases or some data out there which maybe you do need high availability or protection, but you're not so bothered about it having, you know, absolute fault tolerance as well. So again, you've got flexibility on having different condition failures to fail over your SQL Server service there as well. And again, you can have different ones with different clustering. So the diagnostics is returned regardless of the failure condition level. The is live and looks live result is based on the diagnostics and the failure condition level. And all levels are ultimately optimized to minimize false failures as well, which obviously is very important, and something which we did see a bit of in the previous editions of clustering. And probably another enhancement of SQL Server as well is predictable recovery time with the background checkpointing. So by default, and again this does depend on what's on the server in regards to batch requests per second and loads on the server, but by default really you checkpoint in previous editions of SQL Server about every 2 minutes. Okay, and that's the time ultimately there that we write to the hard disk effectively. But what we can do now in SQL Server 2012, or with clustering in particular, is we can actually change that checkpoint in time as well. Again, to be more flexible and to basically try and protect our data and write it to disk. Okay, there's only 3 more slides for me, so hopefully you'll be pleased with that. Actually, there's 4 including this one. But this one is an important slide. It's not necessarily illustrating the important features of SQL Server. What it does show is the security enhancements that SQL Server has made over the years. So this is a quick graph, and I'm sure most of you have seen similar ones. So this was captured from January 2002 to June 2010. And again, we've gone through the different versions of SQL Server and really shows the most kind of outages that we've had, or the most security threats that we've had from the major database platforms. Now, as you can see there, SQL Server over these 8-year period has actually been the most secure of any of the major database platforms. Okay, it's had the least amount of security critical patches applied. And really that's something I think you should feel or should give the users a lot of confidence in as well. And again, Microsoft's gone even further as well with this in 2012. So as my colleague Mark touched upon earlier, there have been a few changes in regards of what we call contained databases. So for example, Mark gave earlier with the mirroring, is if someone's failing over to another instance of SQL Server, what happens to the logins? We have to copy them all over. What happens to jobs? We have to copy them all over. What happens then if we've got two instances of SQL Server or 2 mirrored nodes of SQL Server? We then ideally in a best practice world should make sure that only one set of jobs are running. So we then need another job and a trigger to disable any jobs which haven't got that particular database category on that live on that server. Okay, and again, as you can sound probably by my voice, you again kind of escalating the complexity on your solution. So again, as my colleague touched upon, databases have never really been all that dependent. What 2012 gives you is it intends to reduce or eliminate the dependencies that the database has on the SQL Server instance. So effectively make it easier to migrate a database to a new instance of SQL Server. You can now define a user with a password at the database level, and that's the point really that we must stress here. So again, if you move that database, that login moves with it. By authenticating at the database level, you can move the database to a new server, and the application can change a connection string without having to create a new SQL Server login. So again, making your life easier, making developers' lives easier as well. Also as well, TempDB will automatically create objects using the collation of the contained database rather than the server default. Now again, that's a major change as well. So again, in the old rounds of SQL Server, if you had temporary tables being created by your application, again, you could face a few collation issues there as well. So what SQL Server does now is it forces that collation from the database level itself. Okay, so the penultimate feature I just want to quickly go over as well is the column store indexes. So column store indexes is really ultimately a different approach on how we're storing our data effectively, or how we're retrieving our data. So it stores data column-wise. Okay, so each page stores the data from a single column. So in the old days, obviously you've got rows, obviously you've got partitioning, but sometimes what we wanted for quick retrieval of particular data is we just wanted to have a particular column with an index on a particular column. Now in the past we have got items like covering indexes, which kind of partly achieve that goal, but never fully, and especially in regards of having that performance gain as well. So what we can do now is have only that particular column stored on that particular page. Okay, so it's highly compressed. It's about 2 times more compressed than page compression, which is the highest format that we have at the moment. And most of the time there, depending on data type, but you could expect to see maybe 60 to 70% in rounds of compression. More data fits into memory, so we don't have to then ultimately page out to the disk to try and retrieve it, which in general terms is about a 10-fold on performance. And each column can be accessed independently, so you can use the new fetch features as well in regards of T-SQL. The fetch only need the columns, but the key thing really is ultimately to reduce the I/O on the I/O subsystem there as well. So again, depends on what we need in regards of data retrieval. This can dramatically save time. And my last quick point I want to speak about is support for the Windows Core edition of SQL Server. So in many respects, what's held up SQL Server in the past has been sometimes Windows itself. Okay, so nowadays we have Windows Core edition. So for anyone who's not familiar with Core edition, that's effectively a silent, non-GUI or minimal GUI edition of Windows Server. Okay, so the advantages around that are less patching, less downtime, because ultimately a lot of the patching that we have in regards of previous editions of SQL Server are around patching GUI components, ironically. Okay, so now without that GUI or that forward-facing section as well in regards to security threat, we have less patching, less downtime, and less smaller attack of service area.
Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today here in this webcast about SQL Server 2012. We'll be talking about some of the edition changes, discontinued editions, new editions. We'll also be touching about the licensing changes. The licensing models will have some changes to them when SQL Server 2012 is released on the 1st of April. But to help us understand what the changes are and their impact, I think we should just remind ourselves about SQL Server 2008 R2, the current editions, and the licensing models we've got. I'm just going to touch on the editions here. So we have 3 types of editions really. We have the principal ones, we have the specialized, and we have the breadth. In the principal ones, we have the standard edition of SQL Server 2008 R2, we have Enterprise, and we have the top SKU, which is Data Center. Under Specialized, we have the web edition of SQL Server, we have the standard for small business, and we have appliances. Appliances come with all sorts of editions of SQL servers depending on the size and type of the workload going on the appliance. Under breadth, we have the Compact, Express, Workgroup, and of course the Developer Edition, which is available for free with MSDN or for $50 without. Now, in 2012, the Data Center Edition will be discontinued, and also the standard for small business as well as the Workgroup. So 3 editions will be discontinued, and in their place we will have new introductions. So in 2012, the web edition will be available only through service provider licensing agreement if you need it. The Enterprise edition will be bumped up as a new top SKU, and we will have a new edition introduced called Business Intelligence, and its use is obviously, as the name suggests, is for business intelligence. And with that in mind, having a look at what you would use each edition for. We will be touching on that very shortly. So with the three main principal editions, Standard, Business Intelligence and Enterprise, this slide does give you an idea about what capabilities each edition has got. So with the Standard edition, you've got the basic OLTP, that's online transactional processing capabilities. You have basic reporting and analytics, some programmability and developer tools, as well as basic always-on and stream insight capabilities. So with the Standard Edition and Business Intelligence Edition of SQL Server 2012, you will be able to have a two-node SQL Server failover cluster if you want. Now, there are limits to the number of cores you will have on SQL Server using Standard or Business Intelligence Edition, and that number of cores is 16 in total. So if you have SQL Server installations with 16 cores and above, you will automatically have to switch to the Enterprise Edition of SQL Server. Now, looking at the Business Intelligence Edition of SQL Server 2012, you will obviously, on top of Standard, you will have the Business Intelligence and self-service BI capability tools such as Power View, Power Pivot for SharePoint. You will have data quality services or quality data services and master data services. You'll also have the semantic business intelligence model. With the enterprise, you get the rest of it. So you'll get advanced security features, you'll get data warehousing features such as the new column store indexing and compression and partitioning. You'll also get all of the advanced stream insight and always-on capabilities. So that's the edition changes out of the way. Now, we're just going to touch on the licensing. In 2008 R2, we had two types of licensing. We had the server and CAL. CAL is short for Client Access License. Server and CAL. And we had the processor licensing model. So that's two. In 2012, however, the processor licensing model will be discontinued and will be replaced by the core licensing model. So we'll still have server and CAL, but we'll also now have core instead of processor. So if you look at Standard, you can still license Standard editions using server and CAL or core licensing model, depending on which is more cost efficient and suitable for you. The new Business Intelligence Edition will only be licensed using the server and CAL licensing model, and this is really to bring it into line with the other business intelligence Microsoft products such as SharePoint, for example. SharePoint is licensed using server and CAL as well. The Enterprise Edition will be per core processing only. Jumping down a level to the specialized editions, again, any questions about the web edition of 2012 can be answered through contacting your service provider licensing agreement. The appliances, SQL Server 2012 appliances, again, the same rules apply as above. So you'll be able to obviously purchase appliances with Enterprise or Business Intelligence or Standard editions of SQL Server installed on them, depending on the workload this appliance is targeted at. So the licensing agreement or situation will follow the rules above. So if it's Enterprise, for example, it will be licensed per core, Server and CAL for Business Intelligence, and either or for Standard. The breadth editions, Compact and Express, will remain free, and so will the Developer Edition with MSDN, an MSDN subscription. If you do not have an MSDN subscription, it will be available to purchase for $50. Touching slightly about the server and CAL licensing model, so we did mention it's available on Standard and Business Intelligence editions of SQL Server, and once you've purchased SQL Server 2012 CAL, you can use it against any installation of SQL Server regardless of edition. So for example, you can, using SQL Server 2012 CAL, you can access an enterprise installation of SQL Server. That's not a problem at all. And the CAL itself can be a user, can be your laptop, your PC, or can be a device, your mobile phone or anything else. Please note that prices for CALs will be increased by 27%, but the prices for the server license will not be increased and remain intact. Touching about the new core licensing model, it's available, as I mentioned earlier, on standard and enterprise editions, and it will work as it's basically about the number of cores in each physical processor on your server, and you buy the number of cores. You buy the number of core licenses, but there is a caveat here: the minimum number of cores you need to purchase per processor is 4. So, for example, the figure on your right there is you're looking at a 2-core CPU there. To license it for SQL Server 2012, you will need to purchase a minimum of 4-core processor license. And of course, with core licensing, you do not need to purchase CALs. CALs are only for server and CAL licensing. The current or the price for core licenses will be priced at the current processor license prices for SQL Server, a quarter of it. So a CAL equals quarter of the price of a processor license with SQL Server 2008 R2, for example. For virtual environments, virtualization is becoming ever more popular. We have simplified the licensing model, and you will still be able to apply either server and CAL or core licensing depending on which suits you more. So having a look at the server and CAL licensing model, it's going to be a case of simply just licensing the virtual machines you have SQL Server installed on them. So for example, you have a physical server there with 4 VMs on it with 2 SQL Server installations only. So you would buy 2 SQL Server server licenses and the number of CALs you're expecting to be using against each installation. Hopefully relatively straightforward there. As far as the core licensing model, again, the same rules apply as physical, really. You would license the machines you are using. So, for example, you license the processes used by the virtual machine. Again, a minimum 4 per processor utilized by that virtual machine. The concept of unlimited virtualization, was introduced in SQL Server 2008, and here it does change slightly. So with 2008 R2, it was the Data Center Edition that had it, or Enterprise was Software Assurance. Now, here you can have it with the core licensing model only, and in order to have it, you need to license every single core on every single physical processor on your server, plus you need to purchase software assurance. So if you have those two, software assurance plus all of the physical cores licensed on your hardware, then you can have an unlimited number of SQL Server installations on your server. So your limitation here would be your hardware. How much can your hardware, how many VMs with SQL Server installed on them can your hardware handle? So really the limit is the hardware, not the software anymore. So software assurance and licensing all of the cores on your hardware. Licensing mobility, moving your SQL Server installations around. Now, before there were in 2008 R2, you could really apply that to certain editions of SQL Server, and there were a number of caveats. In SQL Server 2012, we have simplified this, and now you will be able to mobilize your SQL Server 2012 Standard, Business Intelligence, and Enterprise. If you purchase software assurance, you can now move them anywhere you want, on-premise, in the cloud, private or public. Really, it is up to you, provided you purchase software assurance with those licenses. If you do have that, then it's really up to you. If you do not purchase software assurance, then you can only move your installations once every 90 days. Migrating to SQL Server 2012 from previous editions, with software assurance, obviously I'm showing you the principal editions here. So if we start with Standard, Standard is the most flexible version out of the three because you can license it using Server and CAL or Core. So if you have Server and Cal licensed SQL Server 2008 R2 to move to 2012 standard, it will be straightforward conversion and the same licensing model will apply. If you have a processor licensing model on 2008 R2 standard, then you would be requested or expected to convert it to a core licensing model, and bearing in mind the 4 cores per processor minimum license would apply here. Talking about the discontinued data center edition, you would have to convert to enterprise, and you would have to convert from processor to core. As far as enterprise 2008 R2, again, you would be moving to enterprise 2012. So if you use a processor licensing model on 2008 R2, you would be converting to core licensing model on 2012. But there is one question here. Now with 2008 R2, using a server and Cal licensing model, we've just said you can't do that with SQL Server 2012. So what's the situation here? Obviously, with software assurance, we will be honoring that licensing scenario. So if you have software assurance and you have enterprise edition of SQL Server 2008 R2 using server and Cal licensing model, you will be allowed to move those across to 2008 enterprise until the end of your licensing agreement, after which you will be expected to, you'll be requested to convert to the core licensing model. So no worries there. These are just examples, giving you examples about how to convert from 2008 R2. We'll be giving you copies of the slide. I'm just aware of the time limit I have here, so I will be skipping through these slides, and our friends at DSP will be giving you a copy of the slide deck. Now, there's one thing I want to mention here, which I haven't mentioned so far, and it is the upgrade or migration from the 2008 R2 data center to enterprise edition of SQL Server 2012. Now, we did mention with standard and with enterprise, the core licensing model is a minimum of 4 cores per processor licensing model. With data center, the minimum here is 8. So if you have a processor with any number of cores between 1 and 8, to move to SQL Server 2012, you'll obviously be going to the Enterprise Edition, and you will be required to license a minimum of 8 core per processor. So if you have 2 processors there, you would multiply that by 8, and you will be expected to license 16 cores. I hope that's clear. So the exception here is data center, the minimum is 8 cores per processor. So, with the price increases coming up from the 1st of April onwards, what do you need to do as a customer? Now, before general availability, if you have time to act on it, if you have an enterprise agreement or software assurance due for renewal, the idea here, the recommendation is to renew as soon as possible to avoid having to pay the price increases in SQL Server 2012. If you do not have a software assurance in place and you'd like to move to SQL Server 2012 at some point, you need to consider an enrollment for application platform, or an EAP. How do you get that? You need to speak to your software reseller or your LAR, we call them, large account reseller. If you don't have the time to act on this before the release of SQL Server 2012 on the 1st of April, then the best advice is still to go for an EAP for best pricing, and again, you need to contact your software reseller for more information.
Hi guys. Yeah, I've got to say, I think the new licensing model, although it's simple, just comparing SQL Server 2012, it looks very simple on the surface. It does get kind of tricky when you start to look at what you've already got and what can you use moving forward, and how to make the most of that existing license agreements that you've got and making the most of those for SQL Server 2012. You want to stay current, we don't want to be de-supported, but that can be a little bit confusing. I mean, there was a lot to take in those slides. So what I've just tried to do is just take the main kind of points from that, in that SQL Server 2008 R2 now, all the previous versions before, are physical CPU-based licenses, and they cost. So if you go for the this is an enterprise model that I'm looking at, One physical CPU, doesn't matter how many cores you've got underneath it, will cost you around 18,000 off the shelf for the RRP. Obviously, some of you guys will have special deals with your LARs, but this is the retail price. Obviously, you would want to buy software assurance on top of that, but I've just given you the core price. But obviously, you would need to buy software assurance on top of that. How does that compare now with the virtual core licenses that come with 2012? So, as Sam went into, at the very minimum, you need to buy 4 cores per every SQL Server Enterprise Edition that you want. So, and that is pretty much the break-even point in terms of physical costs, comparing a SQL Server 2012 4-core processor, which is highlighted in green here, which is over here. It's around the same price as one physical CPU for a SQL Server 2008 R2 Enterprise Edition. So that's your kind of break-even point. So what we need to be aware of is that when you're designing your new infrastructure, when you're looking to upgrade it, maybe you want to do a refresh of your hardware estate as well, we need to be very wary of how many cores we are going to be purchasing in our new servers. Now, it's quite complex, as Sam kind of went through the kind of high levels of it. What I will say is that we're running quite a few workshops on this. DSP are quite involved, and we know how to hopefully avoid this red cost for you if you act quickly. So what I'll say is, I won't go into it too much because time is pressing on, but there are ways to avoid this dark red cost here if you've got very high core densities in your new servers, which is what you want. You want to have a minimal amount of servers, but you don't want to be paying that premium. Come and talk to us. We are running quite a few workshops, and we can really help you out there. So, as Dan alluded to earlier, we are looking at a SQL Server 2012 customer, and we are in progression with modernizing their estate from SQL Server, from various versions of SQL Server 2000, 2005. I think there might be a SQL Server 7 in there as well somewhere. So, yeah, it goes back before even my time. But I just wanted to go through what we've been doing there, how do we approach the project, what we've been considering, and having a look at how we are building a SQL Server environment that is modernized, up-to-date, highly available, etc., but also getting a return on investment on that and lowering the total cost of ownership. So approaching the upgrade project. The first thing that we do is do an architectural review. Now, you may do this in your own way slightly differently, but what we try to do, first of all, is recognize what the business does. Unfortunately, with SQL Server, it's not just about SQL Server. SQL Server is there to facilitate an application, a business process, or some sort of function within the organization, which makes it so important. So what we need to understand is exactly what is that SQL Server there to do. We're looking at the applications, we're looking at how many SQL servers we got out there, we're looking at the performance baselines, the SLAs, the SLMs around them, how highly available do they need to be, how quick they need to be responding, those kind of metrics, and I'm putting into that some business logic to say what is the key signature experience that we are trying to achieve here. And from that, then we build a business case from that. So that's that kind of first architectural review of the estate. We then look at technical solutions. So from all of that information that we've gained from our architectural review, we start to look at how do we solve the problem. So basically, at the end of the architectural piece, we come up with a list of things we need to fix. There will be SQL servers that we need to upgrade. There may be too many servers. There may be aging. There may be old hardware. So what we've kind of got is a list of problems that we need to fix. So the second stage of the process then is to look at how strategically can we solve those, and using database vendors like Microsoft, like Oracle, and looking at the latest releases like 2012, how can we solve those problems? Something Dan touched into quite a few times. How do these features make us more innovative? What do we get out of the box? How can we make the most of and how can we save some money so we can pay for this project and get up to date? So we look at the hardware selection, what will be the best type of hardware to be used, what type of software, so like SQL Server 2012, or would it be 2008 R2 for now with maybe a 2012 upgrade later. And then we look at the innovations and the features under those. And a big one in there that I put there, which is kind of what this project is alluding to, is a private cloud. I know some people have been quite the industry maybe have been a bit reluctant to embrace virtualization at the database level. But Microsoft have really pulled out all of the stops to say SQL Server is safe to run in a virtualized environment, and we see that now at DSP in terms of all of our projects. Most of our projects now for SQL Server are run on virtualized on a hypervisor of some sort, and going cloud is the next step from that. And then the very final phase is the actual doing the migration. So, you know, the actual physical moving databases, upgrading them, working through the process of working through the upgrade process to get them to the latest version of SQL Server. And what are some of the caveats with that? So I'll touch a little bit on each of these today, but obviously there's a multitude of sins in the vat. And like I said, come to our workshops because we go into these in a lot more detail. So, what do we need to be thinking about? Like I said, it's not just about SQL Server. We need to be looking at what SQL Server is actually delivering back to the business. It's there to do a function. People don't just buy SQL servers just because they look pretty and they use up lots of power in the data center and you can do cool things with them. Yeah, you can do all of those, but they're actually serving some sort of function in the business. And so what we need to start thinking about is the SLAs, the SLMs, what is it, the applications on top of that. How is it going to integrate? How is it going to be supported? So the things that we were looking at for our new SQL estate and the things we had to consider included things like development in UAT. So we are moving to a new database platform. SQL Server 2012 is new. What consideration does that have for our development in UAT servers? They need to be upgraded as well. In fact, probably before we take our production estate up there, because we will be doing a lot of testing and a lot of performance testing, etc. on those. We also need to be thinking about standardization. So how many SQL servers can we get standardized? Standardization is a good key of reducing the total cost of ownership, and that's a hard and soft cost. So not only just the licenses and streamlining those, but also DBAs not having to worry about previous versions of SQL Server and trying to keep abreast of a multitude of SQL servers. I mean, I've been in that situation where I had to support a SQL Server and a SQL 2000 and 2005. And while it's great to have, be involved in all those technologies, it does take time to try and keep abreast of all the latest and greatest that is coming out in all of those different versions. And then on top of that, you've got Windows, there may be multitude versions of Windows and that. So what you want to try and do is streamline your estate as much as possible. One OS, one database vendor, one database version as much as possible, and it will make things so much easier. And you can use globally the great features that come out in SQL Server 2012. Consolidation. So this is where we are getting a return back from our investment. So what we are trying to do is reduce hardware and SQL Server instances. These things cost money to run. So the more SQL servers that you've got, the more license you've got to pay, the more power you've got to have, the more cooling, space, rack space, etc. And the list goes on and on and on. What we want to try and do is reduce that. And by reducing that, we get to a point where this project can start to pay for itself. It's our return on investment. So how do we do that? What would be the best way? What's the best hardware? That's what we're trying to look for here. How are the innovations in 2012 going to improve things, turning on compression? Does that mean we're going to have less disk space required in terms of our backup strategy, etc.? And these are things we can all start to look at in terms of what comes out of the box and what's going to save us money. High availability. Dan has already gone through quite a lot of features that are coming out in SQL Server 2012 in terms of high availability. But what we need to consider with high availability, which Dan kind of touched on with this tiered system, is which high availability is right for which system. What is our tier 1 need? What is our less important, but still equally important, making our business work, tier 2 doing, and then obviously what's our tier 3, kind of reporting services, those kind of things. And what we want to try and do is have the right high availability for the right type of tier. We don't want to invest all of our money in a tier 1 solution and then come back and you know, those applications just simply don't need it. It's going to be very expensive. So we need to tune what's right for the application. Disaster recovery, high availability, again, is not disaster recovery. We've hit this many times. Some people think that they've invested in high availability clustering or multiple site scans, and that's going to protect you forever and a day. It's high availability Nirvana. It doesn't. There are still times you need to consider disaster recovery, and there may be simple things like a database corruption. There's things in SQL Server 2012 now that are going to reduce that risk, but it's still a risk. You may lose mirrors on both stands at the same time. That's when you're going to be looking at backups. That's when you're going to be looking at your warm standbys and other DR methods. So how do we nurture those? How do we bring those to the fore? And the very last one, we want to future-proof ourselves. So, you know, you don't want to be spending all of this investment. You don't want to be putting in something which is kind of interesting, you know, from where 2008 R2 is now. So 2012 is just around the corner. And it was interesting that Dan put up the slide about the supportability. In 2014, 2008 R2 will be support. So strategically, you need to think, oh, how long is this project going to be? Is this rollout going to be 2 to 3 years? Well, if it's 2 to 3 years, we would seriously say consider 2012, because at the end of those 2 to 3 years, your SQL Server 2008 R2 estate will be out of support. So you've reached the end post and you'll be starting again. So you need to start thinking about what the timelines are of your vendors and where those kind of streams are being supported and non-supported. So, I don't want to go too much into this slide because we want to be very positive about SQL Server 2012 and all of the great features. But there are some gotchas, and there are around consolidation. So this is where we're kind of bringing in bringing home the money. So we're trying to reduce the estate. We're trying to fit. We're doing instance consolidation. We're doing database consolidation. What do we need to do to kind of make the most of that? And there are blockers to that you need to consider, or there are things that need more careful consideration. And those would be things like bespoke applications. They're unknown quantities. You will need to test those against the latest versions of SQL Server 2012. With off-the-shelf applications, it's not so much of a big deal. You will know the latest version of SharePoint will be supported by SQL Server 2012. The latest version of CRM Dynamics will be supported by SQL Server 2012. If you have custom applications within your organization, those will need testing. There are some great tools, though, that can highlight any kind of features that come out of that, and we can go through those through our workshops in later dates. And they do highlight the kind of upgrade advisors will flag things quite quickly, but it is something that needs more careful consideration. It's not just that I can back up restore and I'm at 2012. That needs a bit more work around it. Other things, legacy applications. So SharePoint, the latest version of SharePoint will support SQL Server 2008 R2 and 2012. But the very first version of SharePoint doesn't support SQL Server 2008 R2, and it doesn't support 2012. So your applications will need to be refreshed along with your database estate. So it's again a careful consideration. What versions, and again it's outside the scope of SQL Server. You need to start thinking about what the applications are doing, what versions are they at, will they be supported by the database tier. Support, obviously SQL Server 2012 is out next month. There is an RTM available. I suggest you download it and play with it because it is very cool. But you need to think about the supportability of that. If you use third parties, if your database team is not trained, you will need to consider that and get them up to speed in the latest and greatest. If you're using vanilla SQL everywhere and you don't use any of the new enterprise features, we picked this up in a couple of hours. It's really not that different. But if you're starting to use some of the new enterprise features, you will possibly need to investigate those and look at some trends in those areas. DTS. So big in SQL Server 2000. So if you've got a SQL Server 2000 server that you want to upgrade to 2012, there is a bit of a hop, skip, and a jump you're going to need to consider with DTS. So DTS won't run, won't port over directly to SQL Server 2012. You can run it in a legacy mode, but that means that you are no longer going to be able to make changes to that. So what we recommend is that you upgrade it to SSIS first, and then take that over to SQL Server. So the upgrade wizard within SQL Server does a very good job of upgrading DTS patches. I'll say that, 9 times out of 10, it's perfect. But there are times when it does struggle. So, guys, just be aware of that. So, moving on to a little bit more of the environment that we were looking at, so a bit more delving into the case study. We were looking at this client who has to remain anonymous, unfortunately. So it's all blanked out names, or Server 1, Server 2, etc. Data center A, data center B. But that is a shot of the existing environment. So all of the servers that are in red are out of support, either in terms of their hardware, it's more than 5 years old, in terms, or their SQL Server version was out of support. Yellow was things are just about to fall out of support. It was a SQL Server 2005 server, I think, at the late service pack. And the green ones are in support. The ones that are stacked on top of each other were clusters, so they had existing clusters, and they had 2 data centers, data center A, data center B, which was strategic for their environment. They needed 2 data centers, which were production for their organization. So that was kind of where we came into. So you can see it was very siloed estate. There's a lot of servers there. A lot of them are out of date. So they were doing a hardware. They would need to refresh their hardware anyway. So this is where DSP got involved, and we had to look at ways of maximizing the potential and the investment that they were going to put in terms of refreshing their estate. So we started to look towards, and there's a little bit there, sorry, a SQL Server 2012 environment. And it's a little bit busy, this diagram, but just to highlight, there was a shared storage at both Data Center A, Data Center B, and that was existing, so nothing was changing there. But what was changing is we were building a private cloud. And we actually we did a performance study across all of the existing hardware, and because the hardware was so old and innovations in new hardware is so good, we actually got a consolidation ratio of 23 servers down to 5. And those 5, that is actually with these 2 blue ones, is 2 spare for redundancy. So you could, in essence, say we got it down to 3 servers. But we wanted the redundancy there in case there was a loss of server. We were using Hyper-V as a technology to hypervise, and then we built our clusters on top of that. And as you can see, we tiered those systems. So we had some legacy stuff, which is highlighted in red. Those are SQL Server 2008 R2 or 2005 servers, which were built in their own cluster in a cloud environment, which would happily serve those legacy applications until they were retired. Then we've got our Tier 2 standard cluster, and then we've got our Tier 1 high availability group, always on storage group. So that was kind of the tiered system, and the same over in the other data center too. Yeah, it's like I said, private cloud, virtualization, a lot of new technologies here, but the main one here was that we got 23 servers down to 5. But we were only paying three sets of licenses, which was quite good. So sorry, I've explained all that while having those there. But as you can see, there was the kind of tiered level of system where we thought about things, how we built from the bottom up for this new environment. So. We've got some facts and figures in terms of the business case that we built around the facts and figures. So I realise we're overrunning a bit, guys, so I'll just go through kind of the high levels. But there's the high level of the consolidation ratio we got. We got a good 79% consolidation ratio in terms of physical servers and the CPUs that we were going to light up in the new environment. That was the investment that they were going to have to make in terms of hardware, software, project costs, etc. A complete overview of everything that they would need to be spending. Considerable amount, but when you start to look at what these guys were going to be saving. So in terms of the software maintenance costs, they're going to be reduced because they reduced hardware and they reduced CPU cores in terms of licensing, reduced hardware hosting costs, which are quite considerable, and the administrative overhead for each server as well was going to be reduced quite significantly, leading to a big saving year on year on year. So how did that look? Over the 3 years, we were going to have a return on investment of around 73%. So a big investment up front, but a big payback at the end of it. And the payback time was around 21 months in terms of, well, that's the estimated. We've not got there yet, but that's what they're going to be saving in 21 months' time. So that was, sorry, it was a little bit brief, but we are short on time. But we do go into our case study a lot more in our workshops, and we also have a lot more events that we are running throughout March, April, and May. So if you're interested, please register your interest, and hope to see you then. We do also as well have at the moment running a special offer on we will perform an upgrade for you for free. So if you're interested in getting to SQL Server 2012 but don't have the time, we offer that service for you for free, but you just need to talk to our sales team about that and get involved and just register. So I'd just like to say thanks a lot, guys, for your time today.